so I think I'll take this moment to start the meeting. Welcome, everybody. We're delighted to have you all here. We have a terrific speaker for you tonight, and we're just really pleased that you could all come. First, let me tell you, my name is Nancy Nittigman. I'm the president of the Brookline Public Library. And let me tell you who the organization is. The Friends are a user group of fans of the library, all volunteers, those of us who work with the Friends. And we raise money through dues, very minimal dues, donations, addition to dues, and primarily through our used book sale, which I recommend you all patronize because you can find more things than you ever hoped for very cheap prices. It's open all the time, and it's a lot of fun. What we do with the money, and you'll read about this, each of you should have a copy of our newsletter, which we print in the spring, and please take it home. Friends envelope tells you what we do also. And we do a lot of things to support the library. We run the children's programming comes through us, the teen programming for the library comes through us. We've been able to do special things such as the book bike, which many of you may be familiar with. We started the Spanish collection some years ago. We started the Playaway collection. We started the gaming collection, which we launched last year in the library. And one of the very important programs that we run is our professional development program, which we grant funds to through the application process of staff members who are seeking to enhance and expand their own professional development. And they go to conferences, they sometimes buy iPads, and just get more skilled in their profession. This year, we have two very special programs that we funded. One is the Assistive Technology Program, which is a series of computer tablets with special apps on them that help people with disabilities and literacy development, and that's run out of Putterham. And our brand new Artist in Residence program, which we are just launching. Both of these programs came through our professional development program, and we're very proud of what we've been able to do with the money that we've raised. Before we start with Barbara, our guest speaker, I want to just give you one opportunity and take the moment to let our people who are running this brand new program just give you a summary of what it is. Colin Wilkins is the reference librarian, and he's the collection development supervisor in the library, and he is the staff liaison to this program. And Bonnie Bastian is the curator for the program. It's just been announced, and Bonnie or Colin, Colin, stand up and say hello, both of you, and just give us a short. You can speak from there, or you come up.
I'm going to stand up there.
That's fine. That's fine. Just to let people know what this is.
Okay. So thank you for having me today. I am Bonnie Bastian. I'm the curator of the Artist in Residence program here at the Brookline Library. There were three of us that built this program: Colin Wilkins, me, and Andy Sutton, who couldn't be here tonight. So this is a pilot program generously supported by the Friends of the Brookline Library. Our vision for the program is to create a vibrant new space for art making in Brookline, challenge outdated notions of what a public library can be today, and to reveal the institution's value as a research partner for creative work. We aim to explore the role that a public library can play in the artistic process. We have invited one visual artist to create artwork that will engage the library, its collections, and its patrons in an innovative way, while also utilizing the reference staff of the library as research aids. On June 1st, we named our first artist after a really long jury process. Her name is Liz Knopfziger, and she will be stationed here in the Brookline Village location for 5 months, from June 15th through November 15th. Liz creates artwork inspired by and specifically designed for the space that it will be presented in. Her work elevates the mundane within the physical, architectural, political, and pop cultural landscape, using a broad range of media, including sculptural elements, video, audio, light, and text. With her 5 months here at the library, Liz hopes to create interventions into the public space of the library. So in the stacks, in the children's room, in the teen room, all over the place. These will be both discoverable, intimate experiences, bold external works visible to the passersby, and possibly even small sculptural pieces that you could take home to live with for a week. The work will engage all 3 library locations and will respond and build on the library's collections and both historic and contemporary uses of the space. And there's so much more to talk about her work and what she'll be doing here, but I'll leave that for our first public program for the artists in residence. On June 27th, here in this room at 7 p.m. will be Liz's artist talk, where she'll talk about her previous work and the project that she's going to be doing with us here at the library. I encourage you all to come. There's a flyer on everybody's chair. And we're really excited to have this program expose the Brookline community to a wide range of artists and artwork while drawing the greater Boston community and beyond to the Public Library of Brookline. Thank you so much for your financial support, and we're really excited to bring this program to Brookline. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie, and thank you, Tom, and thank you all for supporting this group. It happens we're able to do this because of the funding that you give us, both for the book sale and your dues and donations, so thanks so much. Okay, to the main event, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Barbara Shapiro. I think that's what brought you all out. It wasn't to hear our slate of directors and officers, I don't think. I'm going to read a little bit of things that I picked up from Barbara's website. As she described her background, in my previous career incarnations, I've directed research projects for a residential substance abuse facility, worked as a systems analyst / statistician, head of the Boston office of a software development firm, and served as an adjunct professor teaching sociology and creative writing. I like being a novelist the best. Well, I think we agree with Barbara. We like her being a novelist the best too. Of course, her Art Forger was a fabulous success, and now she's got a new book out called Muralist, which I think follows up a little bit on the art world and on some of the themes that may have been in the first book. We're just thrilled to have her here tonight. I have to tell you, I met Barbara a few years ago when the Art Forger was a fairly new book, because one of my buddies from our book club is a friend of Barbara's from another book club. So I'm really pleased to be able to say hello again, and I think you're going to have a fabulous time hearing what she has to say about her life and about her books. So thank you. Let's give a welcome to Barbara.
Hello?
Is that mine?
No. No.
Yes.
It wasn't?
All right.
Can you hear? Yes. Oh, there we go. Hi. Thank you all for coming. This art stuff is so appropriate. What are all the paintings here? Is that a part?
What is
It's not a part? The paintings that are here.
It's a temporary
It's a
exhibit.
current
Oh.
exhibit.
Oh,
And
cool.
this changes all the time.
Wow, that's really cool. I like it. This kind of event has been a really long time coming for me. I wrote 5 novels before the Art Forger came out, and nobody read them. They came out and they died. It was very sad. And all of these books, they were published by major publishers, HarperCollins, Avon Books, but they weren't promoted very well. And I used to have to go to, so when they came out, I would set up a couple of, a bookstore here and a bookstore there, if they would allow me to come. And I would tell my friends, okay, Judy, you go to Brookline, Jan, you go to Newton, Margie, you go to Cambridge, because the only people who came to my events were my family and friends. And now, except for a couple of people, I don't know any of you. So it's really great. Thanks. Thank you. So after I wrote these 5 books that nobody read, they were all psychological suspense, and they all took place in the Boston area. And I thought, okay, well, this psychological suspense stuff doesn't seem to be doing so great for me. Maybe I'll try something different. So I thought, okay, I'll change genres. I'll write a book that's contemporary women's fiction, because I like to read that stuff. So I wrote a book that was contemporary women's fiction. And I thought it was pretty good, and I gave it to my agent, and she didn't think it was that good at all. So I got another agent. And that agent took it to all of the big publishers in New York, and every single one of them agreed with the first agent. So then I think, okay, that didn't work out so well, but maybe I'll write a book that's half psychological suspense and half women's fiction. So yeah, why not? That sounds good. So I did that, and I thought it was a really good book. And it is a really good book. And so I gave it to my agent. He didn't think it was that good at all. So I got another agent. And that agent took it to all of the big publishers in New York, and none of them wanted it either. So now a normal person might be thinking, as you heard, I had lots of previous careers, maybe I should go back to one of those. But no, that didn't occur to me yet. I thought, okay, what do people like to read? People love to read thrillers, right? Everybody loves a good thriller. So I'll write a thriller. Unfortunately, I didn't know how to write a thriller. So I went to my local library and I found a book. And if any of you are interested in writing thrillers, you too can find this book. It's called How to Write the Blockbuster Novel. It's a real book. And he says there are 6 things that you need to write the blockbuster novel. You need to have characters who are bigger than life, and they have to be gallivanting all over the world, and the stakes have to be huge, and it's got multiple viewpoints, all kinds of stuff. So I read this book very carefully, and I underlined it, I took notes, and I wrote a novel that had all 6 things over and over and over again. And I thought it was really good. Actually, I know it's really good. It's still really good. But gave it to my agent didn't like it, got another agent, sent it all to all of the book publishers in New York, and they all turned it down. So now, Dawn, perhaps I should get a different job. This doesn't really seem to be working. I've got 5 dead books and 4 that weren't even born, it may be time. So I actually did come up with an idea of something to do. I didn't want to do this job, but I really felt like, banging your head against the wall is not really, my favorite game. So I figured out what this new job was going to be, and I was talking to my husband one night about it, and he looks at me and he says, "You don't want to do that." He said, "You want to write another novel," which, of course, I did. And so I teach writing, and I always tell my students that you've heard, Virginia Woolf said what a writer needs is a room of her own. And I have a room of my own. I love my own room. But what a writer really needs is a working spouse with benefits. And here, my working spouse with benefits is saying, write another novel. I'd be a fool to get a job, right? And then he says, and why don't you just forget about this genre stuff? Why don't you write the novel of your heart? And I'm like, oh, cool. I don't have to get this job. I can write a novel of my heart. What is the novel of my heart? I have no idea. But fortunately, I have a file, and I think that most novelists have a file like this. Mine is very cleverly titled Novel Ideas. And in this file, there are are magazine articles and newspaper articles and postcards and photographs and little scribbles about all the things I might someday want to write a novel about. So I opened up the file, and the first thing I came across was an article about Isabella Stewart Gardner. And I had always wanted to write about her, so I thought, oh, okay, I can do this. And I started, and I realized I couldn't wrap my head around her. You know, for any of you who don't know her, we're so close, I'm assuming most of you do. She lived at the end of the 19th century, and she was a feminist before the word was coined. And she was a rebel, and I related to all of this, and I wanted to do this book, but she'd done so much, and I couldn't figure out a way in. So I went back to my file, and I found an article about the greatest art heist in history, and it just so happens that it took place at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in 1990. So I thought, oh, I can do this. I'll write something that connects the two things. This will really work. Except that I couldn't figure out how to. Belle died in the 1920s, and the heist didn't happen until the 1990s, and I couldn't figure out a way to make it all work. So I was screwing around online and feeling sorry for myself because the book of my heart didn't seem to be coming together. And you know, when you're screwing around online, sometimes you end up at websites that you didn't think you were going to end up on. Sometimes there are websites where you're like, get me out of here, quick, get me out of here. But in this instance, I stumbled on a website on art forgery. And I was just completely fascinated by every aspect. I didn't know anything about it, by every aspect of it. Like, who are these people who forge paintings, and why do they do it? And how do they do it? And what happens when they get caught? Or most interesting to me was what happens when they don't get caught. So I started working on that, and suddenly all these things came together, and I figured out what the book would be like, and I spent 3 years writing it, and then I gave it to my agent. She didn't like it. Actually, it wasn't that she didn't like it, it was that it didn't fit into a genre. And if it didn't fit into a genre, she didn't know how to sell it to publishers. So I got another agent. And this agent knew it didn't fit into a genre, but she liked it enough to take it under her wing. And she sent it to all of the large publishers in New York, and every single one of them turned it down. They said it didn't fit into a genre. And if it didn't fit into a genre, how were they going to sell it to librarians and booksellers? So now I'm really depressed. Climb into your bed. Is it still working? No. Just died.
Need a switch?
Not working? Not working. Did just die. In the middle of my story. Now is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I pressed the button wrong. Who knows? I was so depressed. I did it again. I didn't do it that time. Okay, we'll turn it like this. I was in bed, with the covers pulled over my head, and I'm really pissed at my husband. This is going off by itself. I was really pissed at my husband. What kind of an idea is it to write a book that doesn't have a genre? This is crazy. So I said to my agent, it's definitely going off on its own. I'm really not doing this. It's probably a short edit somewhere. Okay, I can see the little red light, as long as the little red light's on. Oh, it just went off. All right, I'm just going to talk really loud. Unless do you know how to fix it?
I bet we can hear it.
Yeah, I know, but it just keeps going on. You think it's too far from there? All right, we'll try one more time, otherwise I could talk. All right, I'm just going to talk really loud. This is the advantage of having taught at universities where you have 200 kids in the audience. So I'm really depressed, and I said to my agent, just take it out to any publisher anywhere that you think might be interested in this book, because I have some big career decisions to make. So it landed on the desk of an editor at Algonquin Books. Algonquin Books has a very different MO from regular book publishers. The large publishers like Random House, Penguin, they publish 300, 400, 500 books a month, every month. They cannot possibly promote all of these books. And this is why most books nobody reads. It's why my first 5 books were never read. Because you need to promote. There's so many, I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of books published every year. Algonquin, on the other hand, publishes 15 new titles a year. That's it. And they get behind their books and they promote them all. And so they weren't afraid to take on a book that didn't fit into a genre. And damned if they didn't take that book, The Art Forger, that nobody thought they could sell, and turn it into a New York Times bestseller. It was just amazing, and all kinds of great things happened. The first one was I didn't have to divorce my husband. That's a really good idea, right? He's pretty good to keep around. The second was that those first 5 books that were dead were resurrected by their younger sibling, and now they're all available as ebooks and paperbacks. And I got a contract for 2 more books with Algonquin. So now I don't have to get this other job, everything in life is wonderful, and except there's one problem. I've taken money, I took an advance, and I have a due date, and I have no idea what I'm going to write. So I thought, well, The Art Forger, I really liked the art piece of it. People seemed to like it. It had art in it, it had history in it, it had a mystery at its core, and there were love stories in it. So I thought, well, maybe I'll try and do something like that again. So what art do I want to do? What time period do I want to do? I'd always really been interested in the Depression. My parents grew up during the Depression, and they had always talked about, how little they had, and also about how they didn't even realize how little they had. And I'm a sociologist. I was also interested in, you talk about nature and nurture. I was interested in how the moment, I think there's another thing in there. It's like the moment that you live and how that shapes you. For example, my mother told me that one day she was looking in her closet and she realized that she had plastic bags, full of plastic bags, and they were all over the floor of the closet. And she had this image of me that she had died, and I'm going through her closet. And I'm like, Mom, what's with all the plastic bags? And then, yeah, it's a remnant of the Depression, from a time when people didn't know where the next plastic bag was coming from. And so I decided I wanted to write about the Depression. And when you put art and the Depression together, the first thing that you get is the WPA, Franklin Roosevelt's program to get the country back to work during the Depression. And so I didn't know that much about this, but I thought it was really fascinating. They say that you should write what you know. Well, if you've been keeping track, The Muralist is my 11th book, and I ran out of what I know about 10 and a half ago. So what I do is I write what I want to learn about. And I thought, this is really, I can learn about the Depression, I can learn about the WPA, and I started looking into it. And I discovered that there were some major famous artists who had all worked for the WPA in New York City in the late 1930s. Perhaps you've heard of Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Lee Krasner, Hans Hoffman was there, Willem de Kooning was there, Gorky, and I mean, it's just this amazing moment in time. And they were all young, dirt poor, unknown. I mean, nobody knew they were going to turn into Pollock and Rothko. They just thought they were Mark and Jack. They were all there in this one place because the country, the government, was actually paying artists to create art. They were giving them a living wage to pay to create art. Can you imagine? It's stunning. That's just stunning. And all of these artists that were there turned out to create the first great American school of art, which was exported to Europe rather than the way we previously had imported everything, of abstract expressionism. So I'm looking at all this, I go, oh, this looks really interesting. I like these artists' work, but I don't know that much about it. I can learn about abstract expressionism. And these guys, they're, you know, jumping in and out of each other's beds and smoking pot and drinking and partying. And they could be really interesting characters. And so I thought, I'll make them actual characters in the book. And I'll weave my fictional characters around them. So I was getting very excited about this idea. And I started looking more into the WPA and discovered that Eleanor Roosevelt, my very favorite historical person ever, was integral in convincing Franklin to include artists in the WPA, and that she had been involved with it, and she would go down and watch them do their projects, and took some of them under her wing, and I'm like, yeah, I'll put Eleanor Roosevelt in the book too. And so I really like to do research, but I know a lot of historical novelists. And the line that you draw between what's real and what's fiction is, you know, it's a little murky. Some people like, well, every fact has to be true, and then they build their story around that. I was on a panel with a woman who writes, I think they were some kind of, you know, historical romance. And she said, I don't care about what's true, I just like the clothes. So we're all on the panel going, okay, all right. So I'm not over here with everything, but I'm like over here with it. So when I do research, I want to know the exact facts. So if I change them, I know that I'm changing them, and I always include them in an author's note. But really what I'm looking for when I'm doing research are the stories. That they're stories that are going to spark the book. And the story that sparked The Muralist was when I discovered that Eleanor Roosevelt's greatest regret, she told her son this at the end of her life, was that she had not convinced Franklin to allow more European refugees into this country before World War II. And I thought, wow, wow, this is incredible. It was very meaningful to me. I'm Jewish, and I had an uncle who was a Holocaust survivor. He was the only one in his family who had survived, and he came over here as a young man and went through Cuba, you know, all the usual horrible stories. But he became very wealthy, and about 15 years ago, he hired a researcher. He'd never known what happened to his family exactly, he knew they were all dead. And he hired a researcher to find out what had happened to all of these different branches of his family, and then he took about 20 of us on a trip over to Europe along with the researcher, and we followed in the paths of all these different parts of his family. It was, you know, horrible and wonderful and all kinds of things. We went to the shtetl where his mother's family lived, and we actually walked down the street where the house was, and there were old men there who said they knew the family. But what had happened to all the Jews in the shtetl was that they put them in a barn and lit it on fire. So we're talking to these guys and going, oh yeah, right, what do you know? What were you thinking? And then we followed another branch and ended up in Auschwitz. And it was an incredibly moving experience. I'm a writer, so I wanted to write about it, but I didn't feel like I had the right. This was an uncle by marriage. It wasn't my family. So many people had written about the Holocaust from their own personal perspectives, and I just didn't feel good about it. So, I put the idea away. But when I read this about Eleanor, I thought, there's a story here. And this is a story that takes place in the United States. And it's a story about the United States, and it's about the Holocaust, but it's taking place thousands and thousands of miles away. This is a story I can write. So my first question was, who was stopping Franklin from helping more refugees? Turns out there's also familiar names in this. Charles Lindbergh, Joe Kennedy, and a man who I've never heard of, and I've been talking about him since the book came out. Most people have never heard of him. So his name was Breckinridge Long, and he was Assistant Secretary of State for Roosevelt. They were very good friends, and Franklin was unduly loyal in many instances. And his job was to match visas with refugees. These visas had already been approved by Congress. The refugees had already been vetted in Europe, and all he had to do was match them up. We now know that he single-handedly kept 200,000 refugees out of this country. And most of them were Jews, and they stayed in Europe, and we know what happened to most of them. So I'm reading this, and I'm like, I'm gonna get this guy. He was flying under the radar. He stayed in the cabinet at this job through the war. He retired to a horse farm in Virginia, collected antiques, lived until the late 1950s, never acknowledged what he did, and obviously never apologized. So I'm like, okay, he's the bad guy in this book, and everyone who reads this book is going to know about him. So I had my bad guys, I had all my characters, but what's my story? So if you've heard other novelists speak, I'm sure you've all heard about how they're writing and suddenly the characters stand up and run away with the story and they're just, following along. Well, this has never happened to me. I don't know, maybe I'm just too practical. But I thought I had done all of this research and I had all of these good characters that maybe now it would work. So I sat down at my desk and I had all these things around me, and I waited. And I waited. And nobody showed up. So I was forced back to, so I have a PhD in sociology because all novelists need a PhD in sociology. It's clearly a prereq. And my area of specialization was statistics. Also something you would think would not be useful as a novelist. But no, I use statistical methods to write my novels. Oh my God. So, for example, you may not know that every story follows a normal curve, and that can be broken into its 4 major component parts. This is true for its plots, for subplots, for character arcs. And so that's what I do. I use this method to map out my stories. I use spreadsheets to keep track of all my characters. So with the Muralist, because I have fictional characters and real characters and historical events, it was very useful to keep track of them. I use bubblograms to assess the relationships between all the characters. So if something has to happen here and there are 2 people over here, they have to meet over here. So that helps me keep track of all of those things. My favorite chart are tension charts. And this amuses my writers group no end. What I do is I assign a tension coefficient to every scene that I write. what I do. So if the scene is just kind of going along as nothing, it's 0.25. If there's a little bit of tension in it, it's 0.50. If the tension is really intense, it's 0.75. And if it's a really, really big scene, then it's the big 1.0, which goes back and corresponds to those 4 major plot points on that normal curve. It makes perfect sense to the Shapiro method of novel. Why not? But then I use a technique that is very, very sophisticated that you probably won't understand because you're not all statisticians. But I'll give it a try. I use multicolored file cards. Yeah, this is the key to the Shapiro method. This is really the key. And what I do, so like Eleanor has a story, so I plot her out on the normal curve, and she has, so there's 4 major plot points, but there can also be 8 or 16 or 32 or however many you want. So I plot out all of her points, and each one gets its own yellow file card. Then I did the same thing for Breckenridge Long. I wanted black file cards for him. So I had really dark purple ones. And so I did that for him, and then I did it for Pollock and Rothko and Krasner. And then I take them all and I move them around on my dining room table to try to figure out how to get the story to work. And there's something about the textile part of it, of actually moving the cards around, that I think works in a different part of your brain. And there's something about the colors and looking at all the colors. But the real advantage is that I don't like to cook. And this can take months. And that these are on the table, so no dinner parties. It's like, okay, well, eat at the breakfast bar again for dinner. But then it finally comes together, and I put it all together, and then I spent 4 years writing it. And the book turned into The Muralist, and it came out in November. And it just hit #1 on the Barnes & Noble ebook list last week, which we were very proud of. And so the bottom line of this whole story that I've been telling you is that after 25 years in the trenches, I am an overnight success.
Out here that Barbara will be having to sign for you, I'm sure.
Okay, great. Yes.
Is the muralist CERT?
Is it what?
CERT, S-E-R-T, is it CERT? The muralist.
CERT.
The artist. The artist CERT, she's a muralist? No. Who is the muralist?
The muralist is a fictional character.
Yeah.
Her name is Alizée Benoit.
Not based on a real person.
It's not a real person.
Thank you.
There's the other people. Yes.
Well, first I want to comment and then I have a question. When I did my dissertation, I used all white cards, marker on top to color code, and some had triple color code, but it really does work.
I didn't tell you about the part where I put the other colors, the little tiny little colors that stick out of the side.
Very hard to organize. My question is, how does your background as a sociologist and working with deviant personalities?
He's read my bio. When you go to graduate, so you have a doctorate too, when you go to graduate school, they train your brain to think in a certain way. So I haven't actually been a practicing sociologist for 30 years, but I think like a sociologist. So when I was talking about the effect of time on your life chances and who you become, that's sociology. I did, another area of expertise for me was deviant behavior. I taught a class called Deviant Behavior at Tufts University. And that's always good when you're working on a novel, because the more deviant your characters, the more interesting the plot is. else? There's somebody over here. Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay, two quick questions. One, with all those books that you wrote before Art Forger, you must have been getting encouragement from someone. Was this your writing group or specific friends or mentors? That's one question. And secondly, you know, Art Forger has been such a big success. Do you feel that that book is better than the others? Was that like do you feel like that was your best writing?
Well, the answer to the first question is that yes, I had a writers group, and my husband and my family and all of my friends were incredibly supportive. At one point, and even all of the rejections, there were rejections and then there were positive rejections, which means you send something in and the editor says, this is really good and this is really good and I love this, but this isn't a book for us because of blah, blah, blah. And so they were encouraging. And at one point I said, I wish somebody would just tell me I suck. Because it was like, it's like you're getting egged on. Was the Art Forger better than the other books? You know, I have many friends who write novels, and many of them have worked as long and as hard as I have. They write as well, if not better, than I do. And the stars have not aligned for them in the way that the stars aligned with the Art Forger. When I wrote it, I had decided I was just going to write the book of my heart. I wasn't thinking about what was going to sell, what it was, you know, and then I got a new publisher who was willing to go out on a limb for it, and the stars aligned. I actually think The Muralist is a better book than The Art Forger, but it's a little bit darker. So, you know, some people don't want to read books that are that dark. You never know what is going to happen, and it's very difficult to assess your own work anyway, in terms of is it better, is it worse? I don't know. Yes?
You talked about how you came up with all of those other characters, but how did you come up with Alizé?
Alizé is the protagonist of the Muralist. So I had, you know, I had Eleanor, and I had the politics of the time, and I had the abstract expressionism, the expressionists, and the artists, and the development, and the WPA. So I knew from working with my multicolored file cards, I was going to need a character who was an artist, who was living in New York City in the late 1930s, was hanging out with Pollock, Rothko, and Krasner. She needed to have some connection to Eleanor Roosevelt, which is why she was painting murals, because Eleanor used to go down and see the murals. She was going to have to be mentored by Eleanor, and she was going to have to somehow get involved with the politics of the day in order to become enemies of Charles Lindbergh and Joe Kennedy and Breckinridge Lawn. So her character kind of evolved out of what was necessary. So she had to in some way have an issue with refugees. So Alizé has family in German-occupied France, and she's trying to get them out, and she needs visas. So that's how she becomes interwoven with Eleanor Roosevelt, and that's how she becomes enemies with the people I needed her to become enemies with. Sometimes I wonder whether answering those questions is good, or is it really like the sausage? You don't really want to know. Yes.
Just a compliment.
Oh, go right ahead.
But, spoiler alert.
Don't spoil it.
Semi.
Yeah, no spoilers.
I just like the way Alizé chose to be who she chose to be.
Thank you. That was not easy. That was a long, circuitous route to get to that. Yes.
They say that history repeats itself.
Oh God, yeah.
And I was just wondering, after I read your book and the immigration thoughts in the 40s, what does it speak to of today? So it really has a strong message for people right now.
It's really interesting because when I wrote the book, it was before the Syrian refugee crisis. And what I was getting at was, that history repeats itself, and it was about war. And it was about these, crazed men, and they're always men, sorry, but they are always men, and how they want to rule the world and have their view of the world be what everybody thinks, and they go to war, and this is what happens over and over again, and you create these refugees. But I wasn't really focusing on the refugees. But when the Syrian refugee crisis happened, it became clear when these guys do this, they create war, they create situations where people in the countries that they're coming into have to leave, and then they need to go somewhere else, and nobody wants them. So it is history repeating itself, and we have to be careful. We have to watch out. And there's other things that are going on, but I won't get into that.
Last question. Let's do one more question. Then we'll have a
Could you
chance.
comment on how you write? Do you have a schedule for yourself in terms of hours? Do you show your work as you go along? You don't? Do you revise as you go along? Could you just describe the process of writing?
Sure. Writing is now my full-time job, except for promoting. And so I'm very lucky that I can do this. I started writing when my kids were little, and so I ended up writing in a fairly normal, they would go to school, and I would write while they were in school and daycare. Now I write whenever I'm not doing something else. It's really what I want to do. People say, well, aren't you distracted by working at home? I was like, what, I can be distracted by the laundry? Than doing that. But mostly I work a fairly normal day from, now though, the first hour or two is taken up with social media and things like that I have to do. And then I usually write until about 7 at night. And it doesn't matter whether it's Saturday or Wednesday. I often don't even know what day of the week it is. I do show my work to my writers group. I do revise over and over again. I would say every page of both The Art Forger and The Muralist had been rewritten at least 20 times with major, huge, big rewrites. And then there was a third part of the question.
No, I think
I got it. Okay, so it's, it's a job. It isn't, there's a lot more sweat equity than there is the magic that everybody likes to think there is. But there's nothing else I want to do, and I'm just hoping I can do it for a long time. Can I take this one question? Sure. This woman's really
Well, first of all, I wanted to say I think you're incredibly resilient.
There's that. That or masochistic. I don't know which one
I
it
think
is.
resilient is good, but I was also wondering, since you have this long-term contract, what if you have thoughts of what your next book is going to be?
I'm so glad I let you speak. Yes, as a matter of fact, I just finished the first draft. It took me a year and a half, actually over a year and a half, of the new book, which also is my personal genre book. Art, history, mystery, and some love stories. It takes place in the 1920s, and it's about the post-impressionists and the early modernists. And it's set in Philadelphia and Paris, and they're all hanging out at Gertrude Stein's salon, Hemingway, and Fitzgerald, and Matisse. And so in the Art Forger, perhaps Belle had an affair with Degas. In The Muralist, Alizé does have an affair with Rothko. And in my new book, Vivienne has an affair with Matisse.
Soda and your science in Boston, talking about people in Florida.
Yeah.